Teacher publicly embarrasses autistic boy, then discovers he's a math genius. The bell rang, signaling the start of the day at Elmwood Middle School. Ms. Hendricks, the stern and no-nonsense math teacher, stood at the front of the classroom, her neatly pressed suit and clipboard exuding authority. She scanned the room, her sharp eyes landing on each student in turn. The chatter died down as her gaze settled on one boy in the back, hunched over his desk, his hands pressed over his ears as if trying to block out the noise. "Ethan, sit up straight and pay attention," Miss Hendricks barked. Ethan flinched, his hands dropping to his lap as he tried to make himself smaller. The other students exchanged glances, some stifling laughs. Ethan was different, and in middle school, different was an easy target. He rarely spoke, avoided eye contact, and often seemed lost in his own world. Most of his teachers barely noticed him, but Miss Hendricks wasn't one to let anything slide. "We're starting with the review problems from last week," she announced, writing a complex equation on the board. "Who can solve this?" The room was silent. The equation was daunting, filled with variables and fractions that made even the best students hesitate. Ms. Hendricks tapped her foot impatiently. "Ethan," she said, turning toward him, "why don't you give it a try?" Ethan froze. His eyes darted to the board, then to Ms. Hendricks, and finally to his notebook. His fingers fidgeted with the edges of the paper, tearing small bits off. He didn't say a word. "I asked you a question, Ethan," Ms. Hendricks said, her voice growing sharper. "Or are you going to sit there and waste everyone's time?" The room erupted into nervous laughter, and Ethan's face flushed. He wanted to sink into the floor, to disappear entirely. He looked at the board again, his mind racing. Numbers and patterns swirled in his head, but he couldn't force the words out. His throat felt tight, his chest heavy. Ms. Hendricks sighed dramatically. "Typical. If you're not going to participate, maybe you don't belong in this class." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. His classmates snickered, and he lowered his head, staring at the notebook in front of him. The numbers that had been so clear a moment ago blurred into meaningless shapes. The incident didn't leave Ethan's mind for the rest of the day. By the time he got home, he was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. His mom, Sarah, greeted him at the door with her usual warm smile, but it faded when she saw the look on his face. "What happened, sweetheart?" she asked gently, kneeling down to his level. Ethan didn't respond. He shrugged off his backpack and headed to his room, closing the door softly behind him. Sarah sighed, her heart aching. She knew how difficult school was for him, how hard he tried to navigate a world that often felt overwhelming. After giving him some time to decompress, she knocked on his door and peeked inside. Ethan was sitting on the floor, surrounded by sheets of paper covered in numbers and equations. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his pencil moving rapidly as he filled another page. "Math again?" Sarah asked, stepping inside. "You really love it, don't you?" Ethan nodded, still focused on his work. Sarah picked up one of the papers and stared at it, trying to make sense of the symbols and calculations. It was beyond her understanding, but she could tell it wasn't just simple arithmetic. Ethan was working on something complex, something far beyond his grade level. "You're amazing, you know that?" she said, ruffling his hair. "I wish your teachers could see what I see." Ethan paused, his pencil hovering above the paper. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "Ms. Hendricks doesn't like me." Sarah's heart sank. "What makes you say that?" "She said I don't belong," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah clenched her fists, anger bubbling inside her. How could a teacher say something like that to her son? But she forced herself to stay calm, knowing that getting upset wouldn't help Ethan. "She's wrong," Sarah said firmly. "You belong everywhere, Ethan. And you're going to show her just how amazing you are." Ethan didn't look convinced, but he gave her a small nod before returning to his work. Sarah left the room, determined to do something about the situation. She didn't know what yet, but she wasn't going to let anyone dim her son's light. The next day, Ethan tried to stay invisible. He kept his head down, avoided making eye contact, and hoped Ms. Hendricks would ignore him. But she didn't. "We're moving on to quadratic equations," she announced, writing another problem on the board. "Ethan, since you were so quiet yesterday, why don't you solve this one? Ethan froze, his pencil slipping from his fingers. He stared at the problem, his mind racing. The answer came to him almost instantly. He could see it clearly, like a picture in his head. But his hands refused to move, and the thought of speaking in front of the class made his stomach churn. Well, Miss Hendricks pressed, her tone impatient. I don't know, Ethan mumbled, his voice barely audible. Miss Hendricks sighed loudly, throwing up her hands. Of course you don't. Why do I even bother? The laughter from his classmates felt like knives in his back. Ethan stared at his desk, willing the tears to stay in his eyes. He didn't want to cry in front of them. He didn't want to give them more reasons to mock him. What he wanted was to leave, to run as far away from this classroom as possible. But he stayed, enduring the humiliation in silence. That evening, Sarah met with the school principal, Mr. Avery. She had called ahead, explaining her concerns about Ms. Hendricks' treatment of Ethan. Now, sitting across from him in his cluttered office, she poured her heart out. Ethan is brilliant, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. He sees the world differently, but that doesn't make him any less capable. If anything, it makes him extraordinary. And yet his teacher is tearing him down instead of building him up. Mr. Avery frowned, leaning back in his chair. I understand your concerns, Mrs. Thompson, and I assure you that we take these matters seriously. I'll speak with Ms. Hendricks and ensure that this doesn't happen again. But Sarah wasn't convinced. She had heard similar promises before, and nothing had changed. She left the meeting feeling frustrated and helpless, unsure of how to protect her son from a system that seemed determined to misunderstand him. The next day, something shifted. During math class, Ms. Hendricks handed out a particularly difficult worksheet. The problems were advanced, the kind of material that would challenge even high school students. She smirked as she walked past Ethan's desk, her intentions clear. Let's see if anyone here can solve these, she said, her tone dripping with skepticism. Ethan stared at the paper, his heart sinking. But as he read through the problems, something changed. The fear and self-doubt that usually held him back began to fade, replaced by the familiar comfort of numbers and patterns. He picked up his pencil and began to work, his movements quick and confident. The equations flowed from his mind to the paper with ease, each solution building on the last. For the first time, he didn't care about the other students or Ms. Hendricks' disapproval. He cared about the math, about the challenge, about proving to himself that he could do it. When the bell rang, Ethan was the only student who had finished the worksheet. He hesitated for a moment, then walked to the front of the room and placed it on Ms. Hendricks' desk. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. What's this? The answers, Ethan said softly. Ms. Hendricks raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. She picked up the paper and scanned it, her eyes widening as she read. The room fell silent as she stared at Ethan, her face a mix of shock and disbelief. These are correct, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. All of them. The class erupted into murmurs, and Ethan felt his cheeks flush. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, and he didn't like it. But for once, the stares weren't mocking. They were curious, even impressed. Miss Hendricks looked at Ethan as if seeing him for the first time. How did you do this? She asked, her tone softer than he'd ever heard it. Ethan shrugged, his eyes on the floor. I just saw it. Miss Hendricks stared at Ethan's worksheet as though it might dissolve in her hands. Her expression of disbelief quickly shifted to one of confusion. She flipped the pages over, searching for signs of errors or shortcuts that might have explained how Ethan had arrived at his answers. But there were none. Every step was meticulously written, every solution airtight. The rest of the class watched in stunned silence. They had never seen Miss Hendricks look so unsure of herself. The teacher who always seemed to know everything suddenly appeared flustered. Ethan, she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. You solved these problems faster and more accurately than anyone I've ever seen. Where did you learn to do this? Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. I just like numbers, he mumbled. You like numbers? Miss Hendricks repeated, her brow furrowing. These aren't just simple numbers, Ethan. This is advanced algebra, material we haven't even begun to cover in this class. Do you study this at home? Ethan shrugged, keeping his gaze fixed on the floor. He didn't know how to explain it. The numbers and equations just made sense to him, like they were pieces of a puzzle waiting to be put together. It wasn't something he studied or practiced, it was just how his mind worked. Ms. Hendricks didn't press him further. Instead, she held up the worksheet and addressed the class. "Everyone, I want you to look at this." Ethan completed every single problem on this sheet correctly. "Problems that I expected none of you to solve." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, and Ethan felt his cheeks flush. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, and he didn't know what to do with it. Part of him wanted to run and hide, but another part, small and fragile, felt a flicker of pride. Ms. Hendricks placed the worksheet back on her desk and turned to Ethan. "Stay after class," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure if he was in trouble or if she wanted to ask him more questions, but he stayed in his seat as the other students filed out of the room. When the last student had left, Ms. Hendricks sat down at her desk and folded her hands in front of her. "Ethan, I owe you an apology." Ethan's eyes widened in surprise. He had never heard an adult, let alone a teacher, apologize to him before. "I've underestimated you," she continued, her voice filled with genuine regret. "I've treated you unfairly, and for that, I'm sorry. You have an incredible gift, and I didn't see it because I was too focused on your silence. That was wrong of me." Ethan didn't know how to respond. He nodded slightly, his hands still fidgeting in his lap. Ms. Hendricks leaned forward, her expression earnest. "I want to help you, Ethan. I want to challenge you, to give you the tools and opportunities to develop your talent. But I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. He had spent so much of his life being misunderstood, dismissed, or ignored. Trust didn't come easily to him. But there was something in Ms. Hendricks' voice, a sincerity he hadn't heard before, that made him want to believe her. "Okay," he said softly. Over the next few weeks, Ms. Hendricks began to change her approach. She stopped singling Ethan out in front of the class and instead started finding ways to encourage him privately. She brought in extra worksheets, more challenging than the regular curriculum, and let Ethan work on them at his own pace. She praised his efforts without drawing too much attention, knowing how uncomfortable he felt in the spotlight. Ethan began to blossom under her guidance. For the first time, he felt like someone truly saw him, not just as the quiet, awkward kid in the back of the class, but as someone with potential. He started to participate more, albeit in small ways. He would raise his hand to answer a question or share his work when asked. His confidence grew slowly but steadily. His classmates noticed the change too. Some of the teasing stopped, replaced by curiosity and even admiration. A few students began to ask him for help with their homework, and though Ethan was hesitant at first, he found that he enjoyed explaining things to them. The numbers that came so easily to him were like a secret code he could share, a way to connect with others in a language he understood. At home, Sarah noticed the difference in Ethan almost immediately. He was more talkative, more willing to share details about his day. He would excitedly show her the problems he had solved in class, explaining them in a way that made her head spin. She couldn't help but feel proud of him, but she also knew that his journey was far from over. One evening, as she was cleaning up after dinner, the phone rang. She picked it up, surprised to hear Ms. Hendricks' voice on the other end. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Ms. Hendricks. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "No, not at all," Sarah said, setting the dish towel aside. "Is everything okay?" "Yes, everything is fine," Ms. Hendricks reassured her. "I just wanted to talk to you about Ethan. I think he has an extraordinary gift for mathematics, and I'd like to recommend him for an advanced program. It's designed for students who excel in STEM subjects, and I believe Ethan would thrive there." Sarah's heart swelled with pride, but she also felt a pang of worry. "That sounds wonderful, but do you think he's ready for something like that? He's still so shy." "I understand your concerns," Ms. Hendricks said gently. "But I think this program could be a turning point for him. He'd be surrounded by other students who share his interests, and he'd have access to resources that could help him grow. I wouldn't suggest it if I didn't think he could handle it." Sarah thought about it for a moment, her mind racing with questions. But ultimately, she trusted Ms. Hendricks' judgment. "Okay," she said finally. Let's do it. Ethan was hesitant at first when Ms. Hendricks told him about the program. The idea of being in a new environment with new people was daunting. But Ms. Hendricks and his mom encouraged him, reminding him of how far he had come and how much he was capable of. On his first day at the program, Ethan felt like he was stepping into another world. The classroom was filled with students who were just as passionate about math and science as he was, and the projects they were working on seemed like something out of a dream. He was nervous at first, but as the day went on, he found himself drawn into the challenges, the equations, the puzzles. For the first time, he felt like he belonged. Back at Elmwood Middle School, the change in Ethan didn't go unnoticed. His classmates started to look at him differently, not as the quiet kid who struggled to fit in, but as someone to admire. Miss Hendricks made a point of sharing his successes with the class, not to embarrass him, but to inspire them. One day, during a particularly challenging lesson, a student raised their hand and said, "Can Ethan help explain this? He's really good at this stuff." Ethan hesitated, glancing at Miss Hendricks, who gave him an encouraging nod. He stood up slowly, walking to the board. As he began to explain the problem, his voice steady and clear, the class listened intently. When he finished, there was a moment of silence, followed by applause. For the first time, Ethan felt something he had never experienced before: pride. Not just in his abilities, but in himself. Ethan's confidence grew in leaps and bounds as the weeks passed. The advanced program he had joined became a sanctuary for him, a place where he could be himself without fear of judgment. The other students didn't see him as the quiet kid or the awkward one. They saw him for what he truly was: brilliant, thoughtful, and capable. He thrived in the program, taking on challenges that pushed him beyond anything he had ever attempted before. Complex equations, advanced geometry, and even the basics of calculus came naturally to him. His teachers marveled at his ability to see solutions before anyone else had even grasped the problem. But what stood out the most was Ethan's creativity. He didn't just solve equations. He found unique ways to approach them, often discovering methods that even his instructors hadn't considered. At school, the change in Ethan didn't go unnoticed. His classmates began to treat him with newfound respect, even admiration. The same students who once teased him for being different now sought his help with their homework or asked him to explain problems during class. Ethan, though still shy, began to find his voice. He realized that sharing his knowledge with others made him feel good, and the more he did it, the more confident he became. Ms. Hendricks, too, played a vital role in Ethan's transformation. She continued to challenge him with advanced material, often going out of her way to find problems that would push him even further. But more importantly, she became his advocate. She praised his achievements not only to him but also to his peers, helping them see the value in Ethan's unique abilities. One afternoon, Ms. Hendricks stood at the front of the class with a rare smile on her face. "Class, I have some exciting news," she announced. "Ethan has been selected to represent our school in the state math competition." The room erupted into murmurs of surprise and excitement. Ethan's face turned red, and he sank lower in his seat, trying to avoid the attention. But Ms. Hendricks wasn't done. "This is a huge honor," she continued. "The competition is extremely challenging, and only the best students in the state are invited to participate. Let's all give Ethan a round of applause." The class broke into applause, and Ethan managed a small, shy smile. He couldn't believe it. Just a few months ago, he had felt like he didn't belong in this classroom. And now, he was being celebrated for the very thing that made him different. At home, Sarah could hardly contain her pride. When Ethan told her about the competition, she hugged him tightly, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice trembling. "You've worked so hard, and now everyone else is finally seeing what I've known all along. You're amazing, Ethan." Ethan smiled, his cheeks turning pink. "Thanks, Mum." They spent the evening preparing for the competition. Sarah sat beside Ethan at the kitchen table, helping him organize his notes and reviewing practice problems with him. She didn't understand most of the math, but she listened intently as Ethan explained it, marveling at the passion in his voice. "You know," she said at one point, "I used to hate math when I was your age. But the way you talk about it makes it seem kind of fun." Ethan laughed, a sound that warmed Sarah's heart. "It is fun," he said. "It's like solving puzzles. Everything fits together if you look at it the right way." Sarah smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "Well, I think you're going to do great. No matter what happens, I'm proud of you." The day of the competition arrived, and Ethan felt a mix of excitement and nerves. The event was held at a large university, and the auditorium buzzed with energy as students from all over the state gathered to compete. Ethan had never been in a room with so many people who shared his love for math, and it was both exhilarating and intimidating. Ms. Hendricks was there to support him, along with Sarah, who sat in the audience clutching a tissue. As the competition began, Ethan took a deep breath and focused on the problems in front of him. The questions were tough, far more challenging than anything he had encountered before. But as he worked through them, he felt the familiar rush of excitement that came with solving puzzles. He could see the patterns, the connections, the solutions. When the competition ended, Ethan was exhausted but happy. He had given it his all, and for the first time, that felt like enough. The results were announced later that afternoon. Ethan sat with Sarah and Ms. Hendricks, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. His heart pounded as the names were read aloud, each moment stretching into what felt like an eternity. And in second place, representing Elmwood Middle School, Ethan Thompson. The room erupted into applause, and Ethan felt Sarah's arms wrap around him in a tight hug. "You did it," she exclaimed, tears streaming down her face. "You did it, Ethan." Miss Hendricks clapped proudly, her smile wider than Ethan had ever seen it. "I knew you could do it," she said, her voice filled with pride. Ethan walked to the stage to receive his medal, his legs trembling beneath him. As he stood there, looking out at the cheering crowd, he felt something he had never felt before, a sense of belonging. He wasn't just the quiet kid in the back of the class. He was Ethan Thompson, a math genius, and he had earned his place here. Back at school, Ethan's success became the talk of the town. His classmates treated him like a hero, and even the teachers who had once overlooked him began to take notice. But for Ethan, the most important change wasn't how others saw him, it was how he saw himself. He had spent so much of his life feeling like he didn't fit in, like his differences were something to be ashamed of. But now, he realized that those differences were what made him special. He wasn't broken or incomplete, he was unique, and that was something to be proud of. Ms. Hendricks continued to support him, finding new ways to challenge and encourage him. She even started a math club at the school, inspired by Ethan's success, to give other students a chance to explore their potential. As for Ethan, he continued to grow and thrive. He took on new challenges, met new friends, and discovered new passions. But no matter how far he went, he never forgot where he started, or the people who had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. One afternoon, as Ethan packed up his things after class, Miss Hendricks stopped him at the door. "Ethan," she said, her voice warm, "I just want you to know how proud I am of you. You've come so far, and I can't wait to see what you do next." Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Ms. Hendricks, for everything." And as he walked out into the sunshine, his medal glinting in his backpack, Ethan felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because he knew that no matter what, he had the strength, the talent, and the support to succeed. As the weeks went by, Ethan's life continued to change in ways he never could have imagined. His success at the math competition had opened doors that he didn't even know existed. Universities sent him letters inviting him to attend workshops and summer programs for gifted students. Local news outlets wanted to interview him about his journey and his achievements. For the first time, Ethan felt like his differences weren't a burden but a gift. At school, his classmates treated him with newfound respect. The same kids who had once teased him now sought him out for help with homework or group projects. Even the teachers, many of whom had barely noticed him before, began to recognize his potential. But despite all the attention, Ethan remained humble. He didn't seek out the spotlight, he simply focused on what he loved, solving problems. Miss Hendricks, too, had changed. She no longer saw Ethan as a student she needed to discipline or control. Instead, she saw him as someone to nurture and support. She often stayed after school to work with him on advanced problems, And she even reached out to other math teachers in the district to find new challenges for him. But while Ethan was thriving academically, Sarah couldn't help but worry about him socially. He was still shy, still hesitant to open up to his peers beyond what was necessary. She knew how much he loved math, but she also wanted him to feel connected to the people around him. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Sarah decided to bring it up. Ethan was scribbling equations in his notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration, when she cleared her throat. "Ethan, can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked. Ethan looked up, his pencil pausing midair. "Sure, Ma. What's up?" "I'm so proud of you," Sarah began, her voice gentle. "You've accomplished so much and you've worked so hard to get here. But I just want to make sure you're happy." "Are you happy, sweetheart?" Ethan blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question. He thought about it for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, I think so." "Why?" Sarah hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I know how much you love math and I think it's amazing. But I also want to make sure you feel connected. To other people. To your classmates. It's important to have friends, Ethan." Ethan frowned, his pencil tapping against the table. "I have friends," he said quietly. "Kind of." Sarah reached across the table and placed a hand on his. "I know it's hard for you sometimes. But you're such a kind, thoughtful person, Ethan. I think if people got to know you, they'd see how amazing you are. Maybe you could try spending time with some of the kids from your math club or the competition." Ethan didn't respond right away. He stared at his notebook, his mind racing. The thought of putting himself out there, of trying to connect with other kids, was daunting. But he also knew his mom was right. As much as he loved math, it wasn't enough to fill every part of his life. "I'll try," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah smiled, squeezing his hand. "That's all I ask. Just try." The next day at school, Ethan found himself standing outside the cafeteria during lunch, clutching his tray and feeling more out of place than ever. He usually ate alone, either in the library or at a quiet spot outside, but today he decided to take his mom's advice. He scanned the room, searching for a familiar face, and his eyes landed on a table near the back where a few kids from the math club were sitting. Taking a deep breath, he walked over to the table, his heart pounding with every step. When he reached them, the chatter at the table died down, and the kids turned to look at him. "Hey, Ethan," one of them said, a boy named Jack who had been at the math competition with him. "What's up? Can I sit with you guys?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Of course," Jack said, scooting over to make room. "Have a seat." Ethan sat down, his hands trembling as he set his tray on the table. He expected the conversation to feel awkward, but to his surprise, the other kids welcomed him easily. They started talking about the competition, about the problems they had solved and the ones that had stumped them. Ethan found himself joining in, his nerves slowly fading as he realized he had more in common with these kids than he had thought. By the end of lunch, he was laughing along with the rest of them, his earlier anxiety forgotten. For the first time, he felt like he belonged, not just in the world of math, but in the world of his peers. As Ethan's social confidence grew, so did his ambitions. He began to think about what he wanted to do in the future, about how he could use his talent to make a difference. He talked to Ms. Hendricks about his dreams, and she encouraged him to think big. "You could be an engineer, a scientist, a mathematician, anything you want," she told him one afternoon as they worked on a particularly challenging problem. "You have the kind of mind that can change the world, Ethan. Don't ever doubt that." Ethan smiled, her words filling him with a sense of possibility he had never felt before. For so long, he had seen his differences as a barrier, something that set him apart from everyone else. But now, he realized they were his greatest strength. One day, Ethan's journey came full circle. The school hosted a special assembly to celebrate his achievements, inviting students, teachers, and parents to attend. Ethan was nervous about speaking in front of such a large crowd, but he knew how important it was to share his story. As he stood on the stage, the bright lights shining down on him, he took a deep breath and looked out at the audience. He saw Sarah sitting in the front row, her eyes brimming with pride. He saw Ms. Hendricks, her smile encouraging him to keep going. And he saw his classmates, the kids who had once teased him now looking up at him with admiration. I used to think that being different was a bad thing, Ethan began, his voice steady but soft. I used to think that because I didn't fit in, because I struggled to talk to people or make friends, I wasn't good enough. But I was wrong. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Being different doesn't mean you're less. It means you see the world in a way that no one else can. It means you have something unique to offer, something no one else can give. And when you find the people who see that in you, who believe in you, everything changes. The audience erupted into applause, and Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had shared a part of himself he had always kept hidden, and instead of rejection, he was met with acceptance. After the assembly, Sarah hugged Ethan tightly, her tears falling freely. "You were amazing," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." Ms. Hendricks approached them, her smile radiant. "Ethan, that was incredible. You've inspired so many people today, including me." Ethan blushed, but he couldn't stop smiling. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged, not just in the classroom, but in the world. As he walked out of the auditorium with Sarah by his side, Ethan thought about everything he had been through, the struggles, the doubts, the moments of pain and triumph. He realized that every step of his journey had brought him to this moment, and he wouldn't change a thing. Because he knew now that being different wasn't a weakness. It was his greatest strength. Ethan's life after the assembly didn't go back to normal, because normal no longer existed for him. His story had resonated with so many people at school and beyond, and it seemed like everywhere he went, someone wanted to talk to him, congratulate him, or ask him questions about math. At first, the attention felt overwhelming. Ethan had spent most of his life trying to stay invisible, and now it felt like everyone was looking at him. But with each conversation, with each handshake or kind word, he grew more comfortable. People weren't laughing at him anymore. They were listening, and that made all the difference. At school, Ethan began helping Ms. Hendricks with the newly formed math club. The club had started small, with just a handful of students, but after Ethan's assembly speech, it exploded in popularity. Kids who had never been interested in math before showed up, eager to see what all the excitement was about. Ethan became a mentor to many of them, showing them how to approach problems in new and creative ways. One afternoon, as Ethan was helping a younger student work through a tricky equation, Ms. Hendricks called him over. "Ethan, there's someone I'd like you to meet," she said, motioning to a man standing near the door. He was tall, with a friendly smile and a sharp suit that made him look both approachable and important. "This is Dr. Patel," Ms. Hendricks continued. "He's a professor at the university and runs a program for gifted students. I've told him all about you." Ethan felt his cheeks flush. "Hi," he said softly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Dr. Patel extended a hand, his smile warm. "It's great to finally meet you, Ethan. I've heard so many wonderful things about you." Ethan shook his hand, feeling both nervous and excited. "Thanks," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Patel crouched slightly so he was at eye level with Ethan. "Ms. Hendricks has shared some of your work with me, and I have to say, I'm very impressed. You have a remarkable talent, Ethan. Have you ever thought about pursuing math or science as a career?" Ethan nodded slowly. "I like math," he said simply. Dr. Patel chuckled. "Well, that's a good start. I run a summer program for students like you, kids who love math and want to explore it at a deeper level. It's a chance to work with professors, tackle real-world problems, and meet other students who share your passion. I think you'd be a perfect fit." Ethan's eyes widened. The idea of spending a summer immersed in math, surrounded by people who understood him, was thrilling. But it was also intimidating. He glanced at Ms. Hendricks, who gave him an encouraging nod. "You don't have to decide right now," Dr. Patel added. "Think about it, talk to your mom, and let me know. I'd love to have you in the program." "Okay," Ethan said, his mind already racing with possibilities. That evening, Ethan told Sarah about the program. Her eyes lit up as she listened, her pride evident in every word she spoke. "That sounds amazing, Ethan," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "You've worked so hard, and this is such a wonderful opportunity. I think you should go for it." Ethan hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. "What if I'm not good enough?" he asked quietly. Sarah's heart broke at the vulnerability in his voice. She knelt beside him, cupping his face in her hands. "Ethan, you are more than good enough. You've already proven that. And this program isn't about being perfect. It's about learning, growing, and doing what you love. You deserve this." Ethan nodded slowly, his mom's words sinking in. He said, "I'll do it." The summer program was unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced. The university campus was vast and bustling, filled with students from all over the state. At first, Ethan felt out of place among the sea of unfamiliar faces, but as the days went on, he began to settle in. The classes were challenging but exciting, covering topics he had only dreamed of exploring. Ethan thrived under the guidance of the professors, who encouraged him to think outside the box and approach problems in new ways. He discovered a love for coding, learning how to use algorithms to solve complex equations. He even got to work on a group project that involved designing a model for predicting weather patterns, a task that combined math, science, and teamwork in ways he had never imagined. For the first time, Ethan felt like he was part of a community. The other students shared his passion for math and science, and they embraced his quiet nature without judgment. They encouraged him to share his ideas, and when he did, they listened with genuine interest. It was a world where he didn't have to explain himself, where he was understood and appreciated for who he was. Back at home, Sarah couldn't believe the transformation in her son. When he returned from the program, he was more confident, more open, and more excited about the future than she had ever seen him. He talked endlessly about the projects he had worked on, the friends he had made, and the possibilities that lay ahead. "I want to go to college," he told her one evening, his eyes shining with determination. "I want to study math and science and, I don't know, maybe work on something big, like helping people or solving problems." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I think that's a wonderful goal, Ethan. And I know you'll achieve it." As Ethan entered high school, his journey continued. He joined the school's math and robotics teams, competing in tournaments and earning accolades for his innovative solutions. He became a mentor to younger students, just as Ms. Hendricks had been for him, and he found joy in helping others discover their own potential. But more importantly, Ethan had found his place in the world. He no longer felt like an outsider, defined by his differences. Instead, he saw those differences as strengths, qualities that made him unique and valuable. One afternoon, as he prepared for a robotics competition, Ethan received a letter in the mail. It was from the university where he had attended the summer program, inviting him to apply for an early admission scholarship. Ethan held the letter in his hands, his heart pounding with excitement. This was it, the next step in a journey that had once seemed impossible. He showed the letter to Sarah, who hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "You've come so far, Ethan. And this is just the beginning." Years later, Ethan stood on the stage of a packed auditorium, this time as the keynote speaker at a prestigious STEM conference. He had achieved more than he had ever thought possible, graduating at the top of his class, earning a degree in mathematics, and working on groundbreaking research in the field of data science. But as he looked out at the audience, his thoughts drifted back to where it all began. "Being different isn't always easy," he said, his voice steady and clear. "But it's our differences that give us the power to see the world in ways others can't. To solve problems no one else has solved. To make a difference." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I used to think that being different meant I didn't belong. But now I know that it's because of my differences that I found my place in the world. And I hope that all of you, whether you feel different or not, can find your place too." The audience erupted into applause, and as Ethan stepped off the stage, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. For his mom, who had always believed in him. For Ms. Hendricks, who had seen his potential. And for the journey that had brought him here. A journey that had taught him the true power of embracing who he was. After Ethan's keynote speech, his life shifted into a steady rhythm of growth and opportunities. The message he had shared on that stage reached far beyond the conference hall. Clips of his speech spread across social media, where they were watched by thousands of people. Messages poured in from students, parents, and teachers who were inspired by his story. But for Ethan, the true joy wasn't in the recognition. It was in the chance to keep doing what he loved. His work in data science, a field that perfectly combined his love of math and solving real-world problems, allowed him to make meaningful contributions. Whether it was optimizing healthcare systems or designing algorithms to predict natural disasters, Ethan poured his heart into every project he undertook. Back home, Sarah often marveled at the young man her son had become. She thought back to those early days, when Ethan had come home from school with tears in his eyes, convinced he didn't belong. Now, she watched as he confidently led teams, spoke to audiences, and mentored young students who reminded him of his younger self. "Mom," Ethan said one evening as they sat on the porch of the home he had bought for her, "I wouldn't be here without you." Sarah smiled, her eyes misting with emotion. "Ethan, I just gave you a little nudge. The rest was all you." Ethan shook his head, his gaze softening. "You believed in me when no one else did. When I didn't even believe in myself. That made all the difference." One day, Ethan received an email from his old middle school. It was an invitation to speak at their career day, a chance to share his story with the next generation of students. Ethan hesitated at first. Returning to the place where he had once felt so out of place stirred up memories he wasn't sure he wanted to revisit. But he also knew how important it was to show those students, especially the ones who felt like he once did, that they had a future worth fighting for. When he arrived at Elmwood Middle School, the memories came flooding back. The halls looked smaller than he remembered, the classrooms more crowded. He passed by Ms. Hendricks' old room and paused, a smile tugging at his lips. He thought about all the afternoons he had spent there, working on problems that seemed impossible until she convinced him otherwise. The Career Day assembly was held in the same auditorium where Ethan had once delivered his speech as a middle schooler. He stood backstage, adjusting his tie, when a familiar voice called out to him. "Ethan Thompson. I had a feeling I'd see you again." He turned to see Miss Hendricks, her face lighting up with pride. She looked just as he remembered, though her hair was a little grayer, and her posture a little more relaxed. "Miss Hendricks," Ethan said, his voice warm. "It's so good to see you." She stepped forward and pulled him into a hug, something that would have been unimaginable all those years ago. "I've been following your journey," she said. "You've done so much, Ethan. More than I ever dreamed." Ethan smiled, his chest tightening with gratitude. "I wouldn't be here without you. You were the first person who saw something in me, even when I couldn't." Miss Hendricks shook her head. "All I did was open the door, Ethan. You walked through it." They talked for a few more minutes before it was time for Ethan to take the stage. As he stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of young faces, he saw himself in so many of them. The shy kids who sat in the back, avoiding eye contact. The eager ones who leaned forward, already dreaming of their futures. He felt a responsibility to show them what was possible. "I used to sit where you are now," Ethan began, his voice calm but confident. "And if you had told me then that I would be standing here today, I wouldn't have believed you." The students listened intently as Ethan shared his story, the struggles, the setbacks, and the moments of triumph that had shaped his journey. He talked about the power of finding your passion, the importance of perseverance, and the value of surrounding yourself with people who believe in you. "But most importantly," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room, "I want you to know that being different is not a weakness. It's a strength. It's what makes you unique, what gives you the power to see the world in ways no one else can. So don't be afraid to embrace it. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. Because you do." When he finished, the auditorium erupted into applause. Ethan stepped back from the podium, his heart full. As he left the stage, students and teachers came up to him, thanking him for his words and sharing their own stories. Among them was a boy who reminded Ethan so much of himself, quiet, shy, but with a spark of curiosity in his eyes. "Do you really think I can be good at math?" the boy asked, clutching a notebook filled with scribbles and equations. Ethan knelt so they were eye level, his smile gentle. "I don't just think so, I know so. And if you ever need help, I'm here." The boy's face lit up, and Ethan felt a sense of fulfillment he couldn't quite put into words. He had come full circle, and now it was his turn to open the door for someone else. In the years that followed, Ethan continued to inspire and innovate. He started a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting students who struggled to fit into traditional educational systems. The organization provided mentorship, resources, and opportunities for kids who, like Ethan, needed someone to believe in them. He also wrote a book about his journey, titled The Equation of Belonging. It became a bestseller, resonating with readers of all ages and backgrounds. In the book, Ethan shared not just his own story, but the stories of others he had met along the way, students, teachers, and mentors who had shown him the power of community and connection. Through it all, Ethan remained grounded. He never forgot the people who had helped him, the moments that had shaped him, and the lessons he had learned. He stayed close to his mom, visiting her often and reminding her that she was his greatest inspiration. One day, as Ethan stood in his office overlooking the city, he received a call from Ms. Hendricks. She was retiring, she told him, and she wanted to thank him for everything he had done. For her, for the school, and for the countless students he had inspired. "You changed my life, Ethan," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "And I have no doubt you'll keep changing the world." Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Ms. Hendricks. For everything. I couldn't have done this without you." As he hung up the phone, Ethan looked out at the city, his mind racing with possibilities. There was still so much he wanted to do, so many doors he wanted to open for others. But no matter where his journey took him, he knew one thing for certain: he would always carry with him the lessons of his past. Because it wasn't just about math or success, it was about belonging, about finding your place in the world, and about helping others find theirs. And for Ethan, that was the greatest equation of all.